Chapter 1. Storm on the Horizon. A Planet's Wrath. The planet Calvarin was known for its brutal storms. On the best of days, its skies were a kaleidoscope of swirling reds and purples, illuminated by twin suns. On the worst, the storms that rolled across its jagged landscapes were violent enough to ground starships and tear through the strongest settlements. It was a world of extremes, a treasure trove of rare minerals and resources, but hostile to anyone foolish enough to underestimate it. Darren Holt, a human freelance explorer, was not new to Calvarin's ferocity. He had been traversing the planet for weeks, charting unexplored regions and collecting data for a private mining corporation. His job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and Darren had long since traded ambition for the simple satisfaction of surviving each day. The storm began as a whisper on the horizon, a distant rumble that Darren might have ignored had the skies not darkened so rapidly. Within minutes, the wind howled like a living thing, and rain lashed against his hover sled, forcing him to abandon his equipment and seek shelter. The cave. Darren spotted the cave entrance by sheer luck. It was a jagged opening in the side of a towering cliff, barely visible through the sheets of rain. He pushed his hover sled as far as he could before dismounting and running for cover. By the time he stumbled inside, he was drenched and shivering. The cave was dark and narrow, the air damp and cold. Darren activated the flashlight on his wrist module, sweeping the beam across the rocky interior. The walls glistened with moisture, and faint mineral deposits sparkled like stars in the gloom. It wasn't ideal, but it would keep him dry until the storm passed. As he moved deeper into the cave, his light caught something unusual, a faint shimmer, almost like movement. Darren froze, his hand instinctively going to the plasma pistol holstered at his side. He crouched low, his heart pounding as he inched forward. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing off the walls. No response. He continued forward, the beam of his flashlight revealing more of the cave. Then he saw them. A heartbreaking sight. At first, Darren thought it was a trick of the light. Two figures huddled in the shadows, a woman and a child. Their forms were alien but unmistakably humanoid. The woman was tall and thin, her skin a pale lavender hue that glowed faintly in the dim light. Her hair was long and matted, and her eyes, large and almond-shaped, were closed as she cradled the child in her arms. The child was even smaller than he expected, its tiny frame wrapped in a tattered cloth. Its breathing was shallow, its small chest rising and falling weakly. Darren approached cautiously, his pistol still in hand. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you okay?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a mixture of fear and desperation. She tried to move, but her body was too weak, and she collapsed back against the wall. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Darren held up his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. I just want to help." The woman's gaze shifted to the child in her arms. "My daughter," she said, her voice breaking. She hasn't eaten in days." Darren's heart clenched. He had seen suffering before, abandoned colonies, war-torn planets, but this was different. This was raw and immediate, a life-or-death moment unfolding before him. The first act of kindness. Darren lowered his pistol and reached into his pack, pulling out an emergency ration. It wasn't much, a nutrient bar and a small container of water, but it was all he had. He held it out to the woman, who hesitated before taking it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She broke the bar into small pieces, feeding them to the child first. The little one's eyes opened briefly, revealing irises that shimmered like opals, before closing again as it chewed slowly. The woman ate what was left, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every ounce of energy was precious. Darren sat back on his heels, watching them in silence. "What happened to you?" he asked gently. The woman looked at him, her expression haunted. "We were left behind," she said. "Our ship crashed. The others, they abandoned us. We've been hiding here ever since." Darren frowned. "How long?" "Days," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe weeks. I've lost track." He ran a hand through his wet hair, trying to process the situation. "Why didn't they come back for you?" The woman shook her head, tears welling in her eyes again. "We were expendable." A difficult decision. Darren felt a surge of anger at the thought. He didn't know much about this woman or her people, but leaving someone to die like this was unforgivable. He looked at the child, who had fallen into a restless sleep in her mother's arms. "You can't stay here," he said firmly. "This cave isn't safe, and you need medical attention. Both of you." The woman's eyes widened in alarm. "No, we can't leave. If they find us." "They won't," Darren interrupted. "I'll make sure of it." The woman hesitated, her fear and exhaustion warring with her desire to protect her child. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "But, please, be careful." Darren stood, his resolve hardening. He had no idea how he was going to pull this off, but one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away. He wouldn't. "Let's get you out of here," he said, offering her a hand. The woman took it, her grip weak but determined. Together, they began the slow, treacherous journey out of the cave and into the storm. Chapter 2. The Journey Through the Storm. A treacherous escape. The storm raged on as Darren led the alien mother and her child out of the cave. Sheets of rain lashed against them, and the wind howled like a living thing, carrying with it a biting chill. Darren's environmental suit kept him relatively dry, but the woman and her child had no such protection. The thin fabric of her cloak clung to her frail body, and the child shivered uncontrollably in her arms. "We have to move quickly," Darren said, raising his voice over the storm. "There's a ridge about 2 kilometers from here. My hover sled is parked there. Once we reach it, I can take you somewhere safe." The woman nodded, though her steps were unsteady. She cradled the child close, shielding her from the worst of the wind. Darren adjusted his pace to stay beside them, ready to catch her if she stumbled. "What's your name?" Darren asked, trying to distract her from the grueling trek. "Celia," she replied, her voice barely audible over the storm. "And her?" Darren gestured to the child. "Lyra," Celia said, her tone softening as she looked down at the little one. "She's all I have left." Darren nodded. "We'll get both of you through this. I promise." A sudden threat. They had barely covered half the distance to the ridge when Darren's wrist module began to beep. He glanced down, and his heart sank. The module was picking up movement, and it wasn't from the storm. "Something's coming," he said, gripping Celia's arm to stop her. "Stay close to me." Celia's eyes widened, her markings glowing faintly with fear. "What is it?" Darren scanned the area, his pulse quickening. The planet's wilderness was home to all manner of predators, many of which were large enough to consider a human, an alien mother and child a decent meal. He had faced some of them before, but never while protecting anyone else. The beeping grew louder, and then he saw it, a hulking creature emerging from the shadows of the storm. It was a Calvarin stalker, a massive beast with sleek, armored scales and glowing yellow eyes. Its jaws were lined with razor-sharp teeth, and its claws dug into the wet ground as it prowled closer. "Stay behind me," Darren said, drawing his plasma pistol. Rex, his loyal wolf-like companion, growled low in his throat, stepping forward to face the predator. The stalker let out a deafening roar, its glowing eyes locking onto them. It was hungry, and it had found its prey. The fight. The stalker lunged, its claws tearing through the mud as it charged. Darren fired his pistol, the plasma bolts striking its armored hide but failing to penetrate. The creature roared in anger, swiping at him with a massive paw. "Rex, go!" Darren shouted. Rex darted forward, his speed and agility unmatched. He leaped onto the stalker's back, his powerful jaws clamping down on its neck. The beast thrashed wildly, trying to shake him off, but Rex held firm. "Darren!" Celia cried, clutching Lyra tightly. Darren fired again, aiming for the softer scales beneath the stalker's jaw. This time, the plasma bolt hit its mark, and the creature let out a pained howl. It stumbled, its movements growing sluggish as Rex delivered another powerful bite. Finally, the stalker collapsed, its body going limp. Rex trotted back to Darren, his fur matted with rain and blood. "Good boy," Darren said, patting Rex's head. He turned to Celia. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her face was pale. "That was terrifying." Darren smiled wryly. "Welcome to Calvarin. Let's keep moving before anything else shows up." Reaching the ridge. By the time they reached the ridge, the storm had begun to subside. The rain still fell in steady sheets, but the wind had lessened, and the sky was no longer an impenetrable wall of darkness. Darren's hover sled sat where he had left it, its exterior battered but functional. "Get in," he said, helping Celia into the passenger seat. She clutched Lyra tightly, her body trembling from exhaustion. Darren started the sled, its engines humming to life. He steered it away from the ridge, heading toward a nearby outpost where he knew they could find shelter. As they traveled, Celia finally allowed herself to relax, her head resting against the seat. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving us." Darren glanced at her, his expression serious. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what anyone should." Celia shook her head. "No, most wouldn't have stopped. They would have left us to die." Darren didn't know how to respond to that, so he focused on the path ahead. But her words stayed with him, a reminder of how unforgiving the galaxy could be and how important it was to do the right thing. Secrets revealed. The outpost came into view an hour later, its small cluster of buildings nestled against the base of a rocky cliff. Darren guided the sled into the garage and shut off the engine. "Stay here," he said to Celia. "I'll make sure it's safe." He stepped out, Rex following at his heels, and scanned the area. The outpost was quiet, its inhabitants likely sheltering from the storm. Satisfied, Darren returned to the sled and helped Celia and Lyra inside. The outpost medic, a grizzled old man named Varen, took one look at Celia and immediately set to work. He treated her injuries and examined Lyra, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle. "She'll be fine," Varen said, nodding toward Lyra. "Malnourished, but nothing some proper food and rest won't fix." Celia let out a shaky breath of relief. "Thank you." As the medic worked, Darren sat with Celia, his curiosity getting the better of him. "What happened to your ship?" he asked. Celia hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "We were part of a convoy," she said slowly, "transporting refugees. But something went wrong. Our ship was damaged, and we crashed. The others, they left us behind." Darren frowned. "Why?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because of me. Because of what I can do." Darren's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Celia hesitated, then held out her hand. A faint glow surrounded her fingers, and the air around her seemed to shimmer. "My people call it the Lumina, but others see it as a threat. They were afraid of me, afraid of what might happen if I used it." Darren stared at her, both awed and concerned. "You mean to tell me you have powers?" She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "And now they'll come for me. They always do." Chapter 3, A Fight for Freedom. The calm before the storm. The outpost, nestled against the jagged cliffs of Calvarin, was eerily quiet as night fell. Darren, Celia, and her daughter, Lyra, rested in the small infirmary while Varen, the grizzled medic, tinkered with outdated equipment. The storm had subsided, leaving the air damp and heavy. Outside, Rex prowled the perimeter, his sharp amber eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of trouble. Celia sat by Lyra's bedside, stroking her daughter's hair. The child slept soundly, her tiny frame wrapped in a warm blanket. Celia's glowing lavender markings dimmed slightly, a sign of her exhaustion. "Darren," she said softly, not looking away from Lyra. "You should leave." Darren, who was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "They'll come for me," Celia continued, her voice trembling. "They always do. If you stay, they'll come for you too." Darren sighed, stepping closer. "I'm not leaving. You need help, and so does Lyra. If these people want to fight, I'll give them one." Celia shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You don't understand. They won't stop. The Lumina inside me. It's valuable. They see me as a resource to exploit, not a person." Darren crouched beside her, his expression softening. "You're not a resource, Celia. You're a mother trying to protect her kid. I've seen plenty of scum in my time, and I'm not about to let them take you." Celia stared at him, her lips quivering. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you." A warning arrives. The relative peace was shattered by a sharp, mechanical chirp from Darren's wrist module. He glanced down at the display, his jaw tightening. "We've got incoming," he said grimly. Varen frowned, leaning over to check the screen. Syndicate? He asked, his voice tinged with unease. Darren shook his head. No, something else. Smaller signature, but fast. Could be a scout ship. Celia's markings flared brighter, a clear sign of her fear. They found us. Rex growled from the doorway, his ears pinned back. Darren grabbed his plasma rifle and motioned for everyone to stay inside. Varen, lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. What are you going to do? Celia asked, her voice trembling. Darren gave her a reassuring smile. Buy us some time. The ambush. Darren and Rex moved through the shadows, making their way toward the ridge overlooking the outpost. The scout ship had landed in the distance, its sleek, angular frame illuminated by dim blue lights. 3 figures emerged, their silhouettes stark against the rocky terrain. They were heavily armed and moved with precision, their glowing visors scanning the area. Mercenaries, Darren muttered, crouching behind a boulder. Great. Rex growled low, his hackles rising. Darren placed a hand on his head. Not yet, buddy. Let's see what they're up to. The mercenaries spread out, their voices crackling over a shared comm channel. Targets are here somewhere, one of them said. Remember, the woman and the child are the priority. We need them alive. Darren's blood boiled. He activated the targeting scope on his rifle, aiming for the nearest mercenary. With a steady breath, he fired. The plasma bolt struck true, knocking the mercenary to the ground. The others reacted instantly, taking cover and returning fire. Darren ducked behind the boulder as plasma bolts sizzled past him, lighting up the night. Rex darted into the fray, his speed and agility unmatched. He tackled one of the mercenaries, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. Darren seized the opening, taking out the third mercenary with a well-placed shot. The fight was over in seconds, but Darren knew it was just the beginning. A grim revelation. Darren searched the mercenaries' bodies, finding a data pad on the leader. The screen displayed a series of orders, including detailed information about Celia and Lyra. She's worth a fortune, Darren muttered, his stomach turning. No wonder they're after her. He returned to the outpost, his expression grim. Celia met him at the door, her face pale. What happened? Mercenaries, Darren said, handing her the data pad. They've got detailed intel on you. Whoever hired them isn't messing around. Celia's hands trembled as she read the orders. They'll keep coming, she whispered. They won't stop until they have me or until I'm dead. Darren placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we make a stand. We draw them out and take the fight to them. Celia looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and hope. How? Darren glanced at Rex, then at the ridge beyond the outpost. We set a trap. The final stand. Over the next few hours, Darren, Celia, and Varen prepared the outpost for an attack. They fortified the entrances, rigged explosive traps, and set up an ambush point on the ridge. Celia insisted on helping, her Lumina abilities proving invaluable as she reinforced their defenses with energy barriers. As dawn broke, the main assault arrived. A larger mercenary force descended on the outpost, their ships hovering menacingly above. Darren and Rex took up positions on the ridge, while Celia and Varen remained inside with Lyra. The first wave of mercenaries charged the outpost, triggering the traps. Explosions rocked the battlefield, taking out several attackers. Darren picked off the stragglers with his rifle, while Rex tore through their ranks with feral precision. Inside the outpost, Celia used her Lumina to protect Lyra, creating a shimmering shield that deflected enemy fire. Varen, armed with an old plasma pistol, covered her as best he could. The battle was brutal, but the defenders held their ground. When the dust settled, the remaining mercenaries retreated, their ships disappearing into the sky. A new beginning. The outpost was silent as Darren, Celia, and Rex surveyed the aftermath. The mercenaries were gone, but the cost of the fight was clear. The outpost was heavily damaged, and their supplies were nearly depleted. We can't stay here, Darren said, his voice firm. They'll be back, and next time, they'll bring even more. Celia nodded, cradling Lyra in her arms. Where will we go? Darren smiled, a spark of determination in his eyes. There's a transport station a few days from here. We'll find a ship and get off this rock. Somewhere far away, where they can't find us. Celia looked at him, her expression softening. Thank you. For everything. Darren shrugged. We're in this together now. As they prepared to leave, Rex trotted over to Lyra, nuzzling her hand gently. The child giggled, her laughter a rare moment of joy in the chaos. For the first time in a long while, Darren felt a sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would do whatever it took to protect Celia and Lyra. Together, they set off into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. Chapter 4. Into the Light. The final hour. The aftermath of the mercenary attack left the outpost in ruins. Smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of scorched metal. Darren, Celia, and Rex stood at the edge of the battlefield, exhaustion weighing heavily on them. Lyra, still cradled in Celia's arms, clung to her mother with wide, fearful eyes. We bought ourselves some time, Darren said, reloading his plasma rifle. But they'll regroup and come back with even more firepower. Celia nodded, her markings dimmed from exhaustion. I can't keep using the Lumina like this, she admitted, her voice trembling. It takes too much out of me. Varen, the old medic, limped toward them, his face grim. We can't stay here. This outpost is finished. If you're serious about protecting them, we need to leave now. Darren scanned the horizon, his mind racing. There's a transport station about 3 days from here, he said. If we can get there, we can hijack a ship and get off this planet. Celia glanced at him, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. You'd risk that? For us. Darren met her gaze, his voice firm. I told you, I'm not leaving you behind. The trek through the wastes. The group packed what little supplies they had left and set off into the wilderness. The journey was grueling. Calvarin's unforgiving terrain tested their endurance at every turn. Jagged cliffs, shifting sand dunes, and blistering heat made every step a challenge. Darren led the way, his keen instincts guiding them around potential dangers. Rex stayed close to Celia and Lyra, his protective presence giving them a sense of security. Varen brought up the rear, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of pursuit. During the nights, they huddled together for warmth, sharing whispered conversations to keep their spirits up. Darren and Celia grew closer, their bond deepening as they relied on each other to survive. One night, as they sat around a small, flickering fire, Darren finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. What is the Lumina, really? Celia hesitated, her markings glowing faintly in the dim light. It's a part of me. My people believe it's a gift, a connection to the energy of the universe. But to others, it's a weapon. They want to harness it, control it. That's why they're after me. Darren nodded, his expression thoughtful. And Lyra? Does she have it too? Celia looked down at her daughter, her eyes softening. I don't know, but if she does, I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe. The ambush. On the final stretch to the transport station, disaster struck. The Syndicate, relentless in their pursuit, ambushed the group in a narrow canyon. Darren spotted the attack just in time, shouting a warning as plasma bolts rained down from above. Take cover, he yelled, pulling Celia and Lyra behind a boulder. The Syndicate forces were well-equipped, their precision strikes pinning the group down. Darren returned fire, his shots taking out a few of the attackers, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. We can't hold them off forever, Varen shouted, firing his old pistol from behind a jagged rock. Celia's markings flared brightly as she stepped forward, her hands glowing with Lumina energy. I can create a barrier, she said, but it won't last long. Darren nodded, his mind racing. Do it. Varen, take Lyra and head for the station. Rex and I will cover you. Celia raised her hands, and a shimmering energy field formed around them. The Syndicate's attacks were deflected, buying them precious time. Darren and Rex fought fiercely, their determination unshaken despite the odds. The final sacrifice. As the group neared the transport station, the Syndicate forces intensified their assault. Celia's energy barrier flickered, her strength fading fast. Lyra cried out in fear, clinging to her mother as plasma bolts streaked past them. We're not going to make it, Celia whispered, her voice filled with despair. Darren grabbed her arm, his eyes blazing with determination. Yes, we are. Trust me. They reached the transport station, a cluster of rusted ships and broken machinery. Darren spotted a small freighter with its engines still intact. "That's our ticket out of here," he shouted. But the syndicate wasn't far behind. As Darren ushered Celia and Lyra aboard the ship, the mercenaries closed in. Rex charged at them, his ferocity unmatched, giving Darren just enough time to seal the hatch. Celia collapsed in the corner, cradling Lyra as the ship's engines roared to life. Darren took the controls, his hands steady despite the chaos. "Hold on!" he yelled as the freighter lifted off, its thrusters propelling them into the sky. A new beginning. The freighter broke through Calvarin's atmosphere, leaving the syndicate forces behind. Darren set a course for the nearest neutral system, his heart finally beginning to slow. Celia approached him in the cockpit, her expression weary but grateful. "We're free," she said softly. Darren glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "For now, but we'll have to keep moving. The syndicate won't give up that easily." Celia nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "Then we'll fight. Together." Lyra peeked around her mother's leg, her opal-like eyes filled with curiosity. She reached out to Rex, who nuzzled her hand gently, earning a delighted giggle. Darren leaned back in his chair, a sense of purpose settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the freighter disappeared into the vastness of space, Darren knew their journey was just beginning. Together, they would face whatever challenges the galaxy threw their way, and they would do it as a family.